right, guys. Well, I think I will go ahead and get this started. For anyone who joins us later, I'll be sending a recording of this out so you won't miss a beat. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Nikki Warner. I'm the Communications Director at the Good Acre. The Good Acre is a nonprofit food hub located in Falcon Heights, and it's our mission to connect and strengthen farmers, food makers, and communities through good food. Since the pandemic began, our community-facing program has ventured into the digital space, so I'm really excited that we're able to offer these online Discover events, and thank you to everyone who made a donation when registering. Your support helps us to fund our programs that support farmers and food makers in our region. You can learn more about the work we do by visiting our website, thegoodacre.org. Now I'd like to introduce you to Jason Dayton and Rob Fisk this evening. They are two of the three co-founders of Minneapolis Cider Company. We first met Jason and Rob when they joined us last fall for our apple harvest dinner at Gibbs Farm. These guys really know their apples, they're committed to sourcing locally, and I'm really excited to learn more about their cider making business and taste some of their delicious cider virtually with you all. Before we jump in, just a couple of quick notes. So we'll be sending a recording of the webinar out tomorrow morning, so don't feel like you have to take notes or anything. Also, my colleague Sarah is going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A for any questions you have. So the Q&A function is just in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen there, so feel free to submit your questions there anytime throughout the presentation, and we'll save them for the end. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and kick it off to Jason and Rob. Thanks for joining us tonight, guys.
Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. My name is Jason Dayton. I'm one of three co-founders of Minneapolis Cider Company. I'm joined here with Rob Fisk as well. And I buried the lead a little bit by clicking ahead on that presentation. What we're going to do today, we're going to talk through, obviously, Minnesota apples, the heritage of Minnesota apples, how we use them in cider making. We'll tell you a little bit about Minneapolis Cider Company, our story, our history, and then we are also going to taste a bunch of cider along the way. And so to get this started, we are actually going to jump right into cider tasting, and we're going to start here with our Orchard Blend cider. So each of you who purchased a 4-pack and picked it up, you should have received 4 ciders. Our Orchard Blend. This is kind of our, I'll let Rob lead the tasting here in a second, but this is kind of our mainstay cider. It's a semi-dry, really crisp, clean, very kind of apple forward. So we'll take this opportunity, we'll crack a can here, and then I'll let Rob take it over here and talk through the tasting. Bonus points if you brought glasses.
Hi guys. Hang on, let me get my video going. So the Orchard Blend, this is a semi-sweet cider. So we're going out there to bring people into cider. We have a lot of beer drinkers, wine drinkers, and we want to make converts out of them. So that's what this one does. This is a blend of mostly table apples, and we'll get into the different types of apples in the coming slides. So culinary apples or dessert apples or table apples, that's what we refer to as what you're most commonly used to. They range from Honeycrisp to Macintosh and Cortland's and anything else you can think of. And the best way to highlight those is to add a little bit of sweetness to it, some fresh apple juice, and make a very, very drinkable cider.
Yes, this is a really crisp, clean cider. You can, if you take a look at it, if you're pouring it into a glass, you'll see this is a filtered cider too as well. All the ciders that we're drinking today are filtered, but you'll see differences in color. This one's a little bit lighter, a little bit more straw flavor, just really crisp, clean, easy drinking. This is just one of our absolute favorites to just crack back and crush. So getting into it. So who are we? Who are these crazy guys here? So like I said, I'm Jason Dayton. I'm the guy who is getting licked there by a goat in the ear. That was actually last year at a beer festival. The Duluth, or the Goat Yoga folks, Duluth Goat Yoga was at Autumn Brew Review, if anybody was there last year, and we went down and said hello to the goats. Along with Rob, co-founded Minneapolis Cider Company, and we'll get a little bit more into the story, but I've been in the cider industry for about 5 years now, in Minneapolis Cider Company and both in Lionheart Cider. And then I manage our social media. I do our marketing, brand design, brand development. So I get the really fun job of talking about cider, drinking cider, tasting cider, telling lots of people about cider. And then Rob gets the far more interesting job, I would say, of cider making, but I'll let him tell you about it.
So yeah, so I went to school at the University of Minnesota for environmental policy. Ended up enjoying the environmental part of that more than anything else. I got a degree in forestry, but then was really more interested in some of the horticulture into things is what I got exposed to. And going down that road, I really decided that orcharding was kind of where my passion was, and just sustainable agriculture in general. So one thing led to another. I was working for the Park Service seasonally and Bureau of Land Management out west. Ended up back in Minnesota with the USDA, and always had this intention to, someday plant an orchard and then use my interest in making cider at home and turn it into a more than just a hobby someday. And then one thing led to another, and I was getting into just the world of sustainable agriculture, which was really intriguing to me. But found out that there was a really high demand for, or a growing demand for cider, and that the beverage of cider, which had kind of gone away for generations, was starting to make a comeback. And so having that interest, I got roped back into it really quickly. And then I ended up deciding that, okay, well, I guess I'm just gonna quit my job, sell my house, and start doing it. So that's where I got interested in it, where I started, and I can get into more about that, how that evolved then a little bit later.
Awesome. Yeah, so I mean, very different stories. Our third business partner is not here today. David O'Neill was a friend of mine when we were in college together, and we'll get into how actually this company got started here in just a minute as well, and I'll tell you that story. So Minneapolis Cider Company, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're located in Northeast Minneapolis. We're at the north end of Marcy Homes, so right off of East Hennepin, tucked back into what is sort of the last undeveloped industrial pocket of Minneapolis, but was also one of the oldest neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And it's a really incredible place to be. We have a beautiful tap room there, pretty large tap room, which is nice considering COVID situations now. We also have a great patio out front, beautiful space to go to. You can get all of our ciders there, not only the ones that we're going to taste here tonight and the ones you see in stores, but then Rob also always has something cooking. And so we usually have some different specialty ciders and things like that that's going on. And then we have our pomology program, which we'll touch on a little bit later in this presentation, but we do cocktails, and those are full strength cocktails. And so if you know anything about the different laws around tap rooms from a brewery, distillery, and for us, licensed as a winery, that's a really unique thing that we actually are able to do cocktails and made from apples as well at our tap room. And so if you are in Northeast Minneapolis, please take time, come check it out, try some ciders. We also have 2 indoor pickleball courts as well. So pickleball is a pretty great social distance activity if you're looking to do that too as well. So the way Lionheart got started, we did not always have a big tap room with shiny tanks and a canning line. Lionheart, which was one of the 2 companies that was my company, Rob started Windfall Cider. Lionheart started out as mine and David's senior project at the University of Minnesota, and here are a few other classmates who were involved with it at the time. And we had just come back from England. We had fallen in love with cider, the culture of cider. We had discovered a product that was unique and different from what we had had here. And my father-in-law was actually born and raised in Southwest England, and so in the heart of British cider culture and cider country. And he's been homebrewing for, you know, the better part of, 30 plus years. So when I got into the family, making alcohol was just a matter of fact and what we did. So when we had the opportunity as part of this class to start a business, we immediately jumped at the opportunity of taking our passion for cider and turning it into a business. What you're looking at here are our very first batches of cider that we ever made as a quote company. These were experimental batches. We drove down to Lake City to Pepin Heights Orchard. We picked up 50 gallons of juice that you can see was loaded in the back of my Subaru there. We hand pumped that 50 gallons of juice into carboys, and then we fermented those in my father-in-law's basement. And we went from there, and that was the very first start. And I will not say that those were the greatest batches of cider we've ever made. We dumped most of those, but we've gotten significantly better at it, thankfully, over the time. So that was the Lionheart. That was the Lionheart side of it. We then went through that class. We launched Lionheart Cider in the summer of 2015 by manufacturing or making our cider out on the West Coast with a few fellow University of Minnesota alumni who had a facility out there. And that company operated for about 3.5 years until we actually partnered up with Rob here, who had Windfall Cider going simultaneously to form Minneapolis Cider. And so I'll let Rob tell you here about Windfall and that history as well.
Thanks, Jason. So, as I mentioned before, I was interested in horticulture. I guess I forgot to mention I ended up going back for a master's degree at university for horticulture, and through that, I had decided that I felt like I knew what I was doing, and I felt pretty confident that I had everything I needed to jump into it, and I was just kind of waiting for the right opportunity. Then that came along in the form of Hoke Orchard down in La Crescent, Minnesota. So some of you may be familiar with them. I know that they've sold apples to the Good Acre in the past, or you may have seen them at your local co-op. It's a fully organic and biodynamic certified orchard, and it's about 25 acres. I knew them, the owners, Harry and Jackie, through a friend in the past, and kind of explained to them what I was interested in doing, and it turned out they were interested in having somebody do that. So I ended up down there to start a cider brand called Windfall Cider, and it was essentially a partnership between myself and Harry and Jackie. So basically what that ended up being is a way to use a lot of the apples and the fruit that was grown on their orchard that wasn't first quality fruit. So they would sell a lot of it to co-ops, but then second quality stuff and juice grade apples would get used for the cider. So we went through about 10,000 gallons of juice over the course of a couple years there, which was a big jump from what they had done in the past. They were doing things more like what you saw in Jason's slide there with the carboys and selling it off of the orchard. So I got down there and helped them grow it into a little bit more of a I guess professional operation with larger batches and some better packaging styles and things. So it grew enough to where we were looking at bringing it to the Twin Cities, and so it ended up on the shelves around town. And at that point, it was kind of clear that Harry and Jackie were interested in focusing on their kind of retail operation and their orchard. And I had kind of dreams of growing it and selling cider that I was making to a broader audience. So what that led me to is moving to an orchard in Jordan, Minnesota called Minnesota Harvest. And that's a large kind of retail orchard where people will go from the Twin Cities and pick apples in the fall. And they were essentially looking for the same thing and had a lot more fruit to work with, obviously, being a much larger orchard, but also a direct market in the Twin Cities. So I got up there and grew, essentially built their cider production, got it off the ground, and we were distributing throughout the Twin Cities. And Windfall, as well as a brand, the Minnesota Harvest brand ciders. So, a long story short, I had known Jason and David from just being in the industry for the previous few years, and gotten to know them, seeing them at festivals and talking to them. That kind of knew where they were in the process and that they were looking at opening a facility locally in a tap room. And about that same time, Minnesota Harvest was turning over ownership, and so things were changing pretty quickly. And I think Jason came down to the orchard on a whim one day. He just texted me and said, "Hey, are you at the orchard today?" And he showed up a couple hours later. And that's kind of how I became part of the crew with Minneapolis, and it just grew from there. And then we were about a year out from opening a place that we thought we were going to be opening the first Harding location.
Yeah, there is a lot that goes into opening a business like ours. It's pretty easy to walk into a place and say, "Oh wow, this is great. It must have overnight success." And we spent about 2.5 years looking for a building, including one where we had plumbing in the ground, and then we found out that the soil underneath the building couldn't support the weight of our tanks, and so we started over from scratch. But yeah, so I mean, we've been grateful to have that partnership with Rob and really build a really stronger company together with Rob. So there's kind of a look at both the Windfall products and then Lionheart Cider too as well, that we both had in market back in 2015, 2017, around that time frame, before we shifted efforts to Minneapolis. So, and that's how Minneapolis Cider came to be. We opened in May of 2019. So we've been open for just over a year. Great timing on that part. We at least, had one really good summer and winter before the pandemic. We're thankful to have that. We have friends who are opening breweries. We're trying to right now, and that's obviously quite challenging. But we're still going, and we've got a lot of really exciting products and things that we're working on down the pipe. And enough talking, and we should get on to tasting more cider, I think. So, all right. So the next one we're going to taste our raspberry cider here. So our thoughts on ciders in general. So we're not a cider company that comes out and says there is a single style of cider that is the right cider. You'll see brands come out and they'll say, only unfiltered cider is real cider, or only dry cider is real cider, or whatever there's variation is. If you look back at the history of cider is a wide variety of flavors and styles and profiles, dependent on regionality and fruit availability, and just simply taste. And so what we're trying to do with our raspberry style here is we wanted to create a really approachable, nice fruited cider. So again, it's a filtered cider. It's really brilliant in color, really nice hue of red. We're taking our base cider that we ferment apples, and then post fermentation. So after we've fermented all the sugar out of the apples, we then are adding in fresh raspberry puree. And what that's getting is that's giving us that really fresh burst of raspberry flavor on the base of the apples too. And so you get this really nice combination of flavors, nice fruit forward. But in contrast to, I would say, you know, some maybe more macro brands, we don't just load this up with sugar either. We add a little bit of sugar to bring back some of the apple profile and some of the flavoring to get the right flavor. But we're never using more sugar than we think makes the right flavor to it.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is this is really what we're going for is balance with all of our styles. The fruitiness of the raspberries lends itself to a little bit of sweetness, and then the acidity is the other component. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about what makes a good cider apple. But ultimately, every beverage or whatever you have needs to be balanced, in my opinion. So you can say it's a dry cider or a sweet cider, but if it's just dry or just sweet for the sake of being that, it might not really be that great. So we don't have we do have a dry cider, but we don't in distribution. We just do kind of our orchard blend, which is what we feel like is a nice balance between the two. And then the raspberry is more tart. Those raspberries add a lot of acidity and tartness. So you add that sweetness to balance them out.
So the other thing I want to chat with you guys about, we don't have anything to taste here, but I want to talk a little bit about all the things that we can do with apples. I mentioned this program a little bit earlier with our cocktails. Pomology is our spirits brand. And so as a cider company, we're really a fruit company. And we want to figure out the most interesting, creative ways that we can continue to use apples in a variety of different ways. One of the really fun things about being a winery is we're actually allowed to make products that are classified as fortified wine. And what that means is we're taking cider that we ferment, and then we're adding brandy to it, and we're adding apple brandy. So we'll work with a mix of local distillers, some larger distillers, depending on what we're doing here. And then we're creating these liqueur products that are cider, brandy, and then a wide variety of herbs and botanicals, most of which are native to Minnesota as well. And so this is a really fun program. It's just another way that apples can be used that is maybe new or different to folks. Our apple seed's launching soon. We're giving a little bit of a peek at the Cafe Chino, which is coming out this winter, and then our Rose Meadows, our tap room. But if you ever want to come by and talk, learn a little bit about what spirits can do in cider and what happens we're talking about what happens when you ferment apples, but we can also chat about, you know, what happens when you distill that fermentation and all the things that go into brandy too as well. So I'm going to take it back, let it over to Rob. Rob's going to talk a little bit about what apples make really good cider and what we're looking for when we're selecting our apples.
All right. When we're talking about apples for cider, just apples in general, there's 4 different categories that we put them into. So there's apples have bitterness, apples have acidity, and apples have sugar. And those are the 3 main components. And if you get those 3 things in different quantities, they're going to fall in different categories. So a bittersweet apple, for instance, is an apple that's high in tannin and high in sugar, but low in acid. If you've got a bitter sharp, it's obviously going to be high in tannins and then high in acid as well. Sweets are strictly sweet, but they have a lot of nice aromatics. And sharps are going to be, oh, there I am. Okay, hang on. Sharps
no, that was my bad.
are table apples. So most common apples that we'll eat in Minnesota primarily are going to fall under the sharps category. We could say it's sharps and sweet combination. There's not really a category for that, but there's, as far as the sugar content goes, they don't have actually as much sugar. So I'm thinking about like Honeycrisp, Zestar, things like that are bred at the university. We come out of the university program. The sugar content, while it tastes sweet when you bite into it, there isn't as much sweetness as cider apples that fall under that sweet category, and there's more acid. So generally, what we're looking for in a good cider apple is going to be a blend of these things, and more so, I'll tend to be lower on the acid side. So imagine if you take an apple that's it's a Honeycrisp, for instance, or a Zestar. It's crunchy and sweet, but it's also got a nice bite to it, some acidity. That's what we consider a high level of acidity, because if that's how tart it tastes when it's got all that sugar in it, imagine how much tartness and acid is going to be in there and is going to come forward once you ferment all that sugar out and turn that sugar into alcohol. There's not going to be that sugar to balance out that acidity. So if you start with an apple that's already kind of tart, oh, hang on, the phone's ringing. I'm sure somebody will get it very soon.
Working cidery.
Yeah. If you imagine all that acid stays after fermentation, it's going to come across as a very tart cider. So another way to think about that is a lot of the grapes that are bred in Minnesota tend to have more acidity in them, and that's just a product of what grapes can grow here. And the ones that are winter hardy generally have more acid. So,
hey Rob, there was a question that came in here. Could you give a couple examples of different apple varieties that fit into these categories too as well?
Sure. So a bittersweet apple, you're not gonna see a lot of around here. They're gonna be things like like a Dabinet, which is a really common cider apple, but it's starting to be grown more and more from those of us who are trying to make good cider with more unique apples. But we're finding things like issues with fruit production in Minnesota. The trees will grow and they'll do fine, but we just have a hard time getting them to bear fruit regularly. Ashmead's Kernel is a good example of a bitter sharp. That one I've had some experience with. It's got nice tannins, but it's also got the acidity and a good level of sweetness. But again, not widely grown around here, or really in general. And a lot of these cider apples are just hard to find, period, because of the demand right now. And there's just so few of them grown in the United States. So if you grow your own, that's kind of the way to do it right now. And in lieu of that, you can do other things to bring in things like tannins into cider that are really going to help round out and add body and mouthfeel. So examples would be oak or hops even.
Yeah, and Teresa, just saw your question come in Teresa was asking, she noticed looking at the cans that our raspberry can does not say gluten-free. You're correct, our raspberry can does not say gluten-free, and as the guy who does the labels, I am raising my hand as a typo there, and as a note to fix that. All of our products by nature are actually gluten-free, being that we are actually not allowed to bring grain or wheat into our facility as a winery. So all of our products are always 100% naturally gluten-free. And I will be updating our labels. So thank you for letting us know about that.
All right. I guess we'll go to the next slide, Jason, if you want, about,
Yeah.
here's some examples. So russets, there's a lot of russeting in these apples that you'll see. So Kingston Black, Roxbury Russet, Golden Russet, basically all of these have a certain level of russeting, which is going to add a lot of tannins. And that's what, when people talk about wine, that's where that body in the mouthfeel and just the depth comes from. We don't have the luxury of using many of these. We do have some Northern Spy in some of our blends. I think some Golden Russet and Roxbury Russet makes it in tiny amounts. But these are historical cider apples. These apples were bred for making cider. Some of them aren't actually very good to eat. A lot of the bitter sweets, for example. Ellis Bitter is another one. Nihu is a French one. If you've ever had a French cider, it's very different. High tannin, low acid, sweet. Different from what we're making in the United States.
Very interesting production process as well, too. So.
Yeah, you can probably talk about that in England, but a lot of orchards in other parts of the world, in Europe primarily, are cider orchards. So in the United States, we grow apples, we pick them by hand, and we pick out the good ones and sell them in bags, and then the other ones go into cider. But if you're planting a cider orchard, if you've got an old cider orchard in England or wherever, you can just let the apples fall on the ground, rake them up, and squish them for cider juice. So there's the overhead is lower, the amount of work that goes into it is much lower, and
the history on that is when you go back to pre-Prohibition America and really late 1800s. Sorry, making sure we had the questions working. And you go back to late 1800s, cider was actually, the most popular drink in America. It was more commonly drank than beer. And the reason was apple trees grew relatively easily across the entire country. It was relatively easy to make a low alcoholic cider by just crushing up the fruit and letting it sit, and it would ferment naturally. You didn't need, the heat and the boiling process like you do in beer. And you would just let that naturally turn into cider, and that low alcoholic cider was probably safer to drink than the water as well. Yes, Carol and Tim, when you crush the apples, the peels do stay in. Yep. So literally you're taking an entire apple and you're running it through what amounts to about a 5-horsepower Cuisinart blender. And then you're pressing all of that together to press out all of the juice from that. So all the skins and everything. And the skins are where you can also get a lot of those tannins too as well. So fast forward to the move to the cities in America, and then also Prohibition. And you kind of saw this double effect with cider where it was too far of a distance to transport cider from rural orchards to the cities where beer was being made directly in the cities and grain was easier to transport. And then also, once Prohibition happened, these orchards that were grown specifically for cider making and weren't really there for fruit were mostly torn out and replaced with other crops or apples for eating purposes. And so the American cider industry from that point really struggled and never really recovered until recently here. Contrasting that to the UK, where cider goes back millennia, and there are reports of the Romans arriving in Britain and the Druids were drinking fermented apples at the time. And so cider really has this very, very long history And as Rob mentioned, for all of our apples here, they are hand-picked. They're typically apples that didn't meet grocery grade, eating grade, where in the UK, those orchards, you can just shake them off the tree, similar to the way you did tree nuts here in the US, vacuum them all up, and they're a lot more efficient process. All right, sorry for my tangent, Rob.
No, great. So what do we do without apples like we see here? How do we bring some of that character into our ciders, and what do we do, but what do other American cider makers do? So the next slide will give a good example of that. So these are all grown in Minnesota. Some of them are bred by the university, but these are crab apples. So a crab apple is a great way to add a lot of character. It's an extremely condensed amount of flavor and acidity and tannins and sugar. They're a lot of work and they're expensive, but they bring in some great flavors in smaller quantities. So if you add, say, 20% of your juice blend comes from some of these apples, you can add in some of that interesting character pretty easily into a blend of sharps or dessert apples. So,
and something that's really good to notice here too, as well, is if you look at the size of some of this fruit, it's a bit tough to tell, but a lot of times this is pretty small fruit as well. It's not necessarily these big, large eating apples like a Honeycrisp. So like Dogo crabs here, they're not much bigger than that. And all those fruits still have to be picked by hand as well. So it's a quite labor-intensive process to get much of this fruit as well.
Right. Yep. So the top left Dolgo crab, we're actually doing a single varietal version of that. So even though I just said how it makes a good addition to a blend of apples, you can use them as a single varietal. We do end up making it to be a sweeter style cider to kind of balance all that acidity. You can imagine biting into a crab apple, what that's like. But the unique thing about the Dolgo apple is that it's actually red on the inside. So that juice obviously is going to be pink by the time it's all done and fermented. So we have what we like to call our rosé sour, which is a tart red-fleshed cider, or red-fleshed apple, making a rosé cider. So that's been really popular, and people are starting to really be interested in different varieties and getting beyond. Honeycrisp, we have a ton of. We use a lot of it. It's available to us, and it's great. But there is more to some of these other varieties, and the key to some of our ciders is just having a different blend, because each apple is going to give you different fruit qualities, and it's going to come out in the cider. The other one here I'd like to point out is the chestnut. We do have a single varietal chestnut, and if you've read ahead, you probably looked at that can of 1949 and noticed it's made with 100% chestnut crab apple juice. So
I think that might be our next. Thing.
Oh, there it is. Huh. All right. So this one is, like I said, 100% crab apple, chestnut crab. This chestnut crab is a University of Minnesota release in the year, you guessed it, 1949. We're finding that the chestnut crab actually is really turning out to be one of the better apples locally that makes a great cider, and actually even a single varietal. It's just kind of hard to get. So we decided to, instead of using it in a blend for a lot of different styles, just to really highlight it and talk about how it's Minnesota's real premier cider apple right now. So It's called a chestnut crab. It's got a lot of kind of nutty character, which does come out in the cider, which is interesting. And there's just a lot more interesting stuff going on with that one.
Yeah, awesome. And for Rob, did you touch on the naming and why it's named that?
Yep.
Sorry,
I can
pouring cider and missing that. So yeah, so actually we'll go into the history of apples here now as well. And by the way, for everybody tasting along, you know, feel free to taste along if you want to. Also, we know this is a lot of cider in an hour, so if you don't want to taste all of them right now, that's totally okay. Feel free to save them, taste them later, watch the recording as well. So. Oh yeah, Carol, that's a great question. So is there a reason we don't state on all the cans which apples are in each cider? Does it change frequently? So it can change, you know, depending on variety and source available at the time. So we source apples not only from Minnesota, but we also source them from a couple orchards in Michigan too as well. And so depending on time of year, product availability, what's available, that could change a little bit here and there. Generally, we've got, you know, the Macintoshes, the Honeycrisps, a couple of those apples are pretty consistent in all of it. The biggest thing that will change batch to batch may actually be the blend of those apples. And so depending on when those apples were picked, how long they were stored, the acidity and sugar levels will be different. Similar to grapes, right? Wine is different every single year because you're using a single grape from a single vineyard, and the growing season is different. When it's picked is different. Apples have that same terroir. The challenge being for us, for the majority of our products, for our raspberry and our orchard blend, we're trying to make them as consistent as possible. And so we'll end up working with those orchard partners to do different blends to try to be as consistent as possible with the juice going in. So generally they're the same, but they're not always, and it can have some variation.
Right. And the apples change from year to year too. So even if it is the same blend, it might be different because of the crop year or the amount of sugar that was in the apples that year or whatever. So all that plays a part. So even if you have a 100% chestnut crab cider next year, it might taste different, or the alcohol content may be different.
Yeah, apples are produce, and that's the biggest difference compared to say like beer or something like that.
Right. Do you want me to go into the history a little bit?
Yeah, please. Please do.
15 minutes or so to go. I kind of alluded to this a little bit already. The University of Minnesota is one of the premier apple breeding programs in the country. They've probably, or maybe the premier, if you think about the apples that they've released over the years. I think recently there's been an increase in some other breeding programs, primarily out west where a lot of apples come from, but they're all taking their cues from the University of Minnesota on what people want. And so we have a lot to be proud of as far as that goes. Obviously, I'm really happy with the chestnut crab apple, which was in 1949, and obviously Honeycrisp and everything after that has been very popular. But it goes back to early 1900s, I think, is when the breeding program started at the university. So apples became a thing in Minnesota in the river valleys. So Mississippi River Valley and the Minnesota River Valley are where you would have found most of the orchards in Minnesota back in the day. And 50 years ago, there were a lot of them. Less so today, now that production and agricultural orcharding trends have gone so that bigger is better for the most part. So Minnesota has actually fallen in overall apple production quite a bit is relative to other states. So I think Minnesota falls in the mid-teens or high teens as far as overall apple production in the country. So while most people think of Minnesota as being a top 5 apple producer, we're not really anywhere near that right now, but we are still producing some of the best apple varieties.
If you're curious, Washington is the top apple producing state in the country, and it's not even close. Washington produces about 80% of the country's apples. So for perspective, you know, if Minnesota's in the teens, we're pretty far down the tail. But like Rob said, the program at the University of Minnesota is world renowned and still is. And then also now today, the Minnesota Cider Guild, which Rob and I were founding members of, is actively involved with the University of Minnesota, the State Department of Agriculture, the Minnesota Apple Growers Association, in continuing to support apple growing in Minnesota and push for the continued development of cider apple varieties, which we're thankful that we've been able to secure grants to help folks actually work on the development of new cider apples.
Yeah, and to that, we've worked with them now directly for the last couple of years, and just this last year we did a kind of a blind tasting of a bunch of selections from the apple breeding program that they thought that the current breeders, Jack Tillman being one of them, the main one, thought would be have a lot of potential for a cider apple breeding program. So they kind of heard our requests, and they're starting to combine their ability in table apple breeding and grape wine breeding and bringing that to cider apples. So that's
Rob, we got a question that came in from Jim here. Maybe you might be able to answer this. Can you talk about cider and cooking and some of the uses for it? Now, we don't have our resident expert, our pomologist, on who could talk for hours about this. So we'll maybe do our best. Rob, maybe you could touch on this a little bit.
Yeah, I guess I'll give it kind of a high level answer other than getting specific about braised cabbage, but obviously that one would work. It adds a nice the acidity level in ciders are going to be a great complement or contrast to a lot of food that you wouldn't normally be able to use. Other, like, you know, we couldn't cook with beer and a lot of things, and you do cook with wine, but it's almost cider is almost more versatile in that way. So anything you could think of that would work well with the flavor that apples bring, but also have that acidity to kind of cut some fat or balance sweetness, things like that. You can think about using cider as well.
Kelsey also asked a question here. So why is the alcohol content higher in 1949? And I guess a little bit more in general, I can talk about why, where the alcohol comes from in ciders. So what we're doing with ciders is we're taking the sugar that's in the apple and we're using yeast to convert that sugar into alcohol. And so as we talk about the variations in apples from year to year in different type of apples, the amount of sugar that's actually in the juice that we get from pressing those will vary. In the case of 1949, 6.9 was the amount of sugar that was in the apples that we pressed and then fermented that too. A different year with chestnut crab apples could give us a different alcohol percentage.
Just in general, the chestnut crab apple does have more natural sugar on average than a lot of the other apple varieties that we use.
Last tasting for the night, and then we'll open it up to kind of a little bit more broader Q&A here. We're going to taste our mango habanero. So mango habanero is a really interesting cider for us. It's a lot of fun. It's got a bit of a cult following, especially our fiery version of this. The inspiration for this is spice is such a great complement to apples. Cider is just great with anything spicy, and it's just a great balance. You have the spiciness and you have the sweetness, and they're just a really great balanced profile here. So we're taking the sweetness of the mango and the apple, and we're balancing that with the spice of the habanero peppers. And the way we make this is we actually take, we go, typically to, the local restaurant store often. We buy boxes and boxes and boxes of habanero peppers. And then we steep those, and we're making a habanero tea essentially from that. And then we'll blend that in again with the mango and the cider post-fermentation to balance out that right amount of spice to it. I would say on this cider here, it's got a really nice mango profile and a little bit of sweetness or a little bit of spice in the back. It's not overpowering though. Like I said, our fiery mango is a bit of a cult favorite at our tap room. For that one, we actually take a tincture that we've made with those habaneros. So, an extract of habanero, and we add basically a shot of that to the cider, and that's got a kick to it. But this one's really nice, even if you're not a huge spice person. It's not super spicy. It's got just a really nice little tingle in the back. Super delicious. One of our just absolute favorite ciders. I will say though, if you do try to take a big whiff of the nose, there's a lot of habanero pepper in the nose, and so you will feel that.
I just wanted to go back to, I saw a question from James about, he asked, are there any U.S. or Minnesota-based cider makers or apple growers planting cider apple orchards specifically? And yes, there are. There's a couple small cider orchards that are grown by cider makers. So I don't know of any just general apple growers that are planting cider apple orchards specifically. But if you have heard of Milk and Honey Ciders, or Sweetland Orchard has some cider-specific apple varieties. They're growing apples specifically for making cider, but it's literally just a couple, and it's real small scale. So for the most part, people are bringing in, if they want those apple varieties, they're bringing in apples or juice.
Yeah, I mean, so long-term dream. We'd love to have our own orchard where we could grow all of our own apples that we need. As Rob talked earlier in the presentation about size, and that he started producing a couple thousand gallons, 10,000 gallons over the course of a few years at Hoke Orchards. Our largest fermentation tank is about 6,000 gallons now. We take deliveries of juice typically in tanker load quantities, which is about 5,500 gallons. So while we would like to be able to have a significant amount of our own apple supply grown here in Minnesota, it would take a significant amount of land and investment to be able to grow that many apples. All right, we got a bunch of questions coming in here. Rob, could you let us know the different types of apples used in Orchard Blend again? Repeat those.
Sure. So that one's got a good general mix. I mean, I can't give you percentages, but I know there's Macintosh, there's a lot of Honeycrisp, and about probably 8 other varieties. I know there's a little bit of Northern Spy, and there's probably even some Fuji in there. But I can't think. Yeah, it's I want to say Zestar, but yeah, there's a bunch, and that's kind of what we're looking for. We want to get the most blend that we could. Honestly, it's when I see a longer list of apple varieties, the better.
Carol, I'm glad the pork and green chili stew is going well with all the ciders. Pairing cider is a great food pairing. I would, challenge anybody who says, a burger and beer is perfect. I would challenge them to try a burger and cider. Cider, has all the qualities of wine that people love to pair with foods, but it's got the carbonation and the lower alcohol of beer. And together, it's just an amazing combination. Hands down, best thing to pair with food. You know, always kind of with any food pairing, think about complements and contrasts, right? And what's going to work well. High acidity goes really well with, you know, meats and fats, cutting through that, and cheeses. Sweetness is great offset for things that are spicy too as well. Cider is incredible with food. I would strongly encourage anybody to reconsider their Thanksgiving table, especially, and bring cider to the Thanksgiving table over wine or anything else too as well. Kaylee asks here, you know, what's your favorite cider? That's a really hard question. Rob, do you have a favorite cider? Of anybody? Could be ours or anybody else's.
Yeah, I'd say of ours, my favorite is probably 1949 right now. I just love that it's a single varietal. It's highlighting a single apple, and it's obviously from a local orchard and a locally produced apple variety. So it doesn't get any better than that for me. Otherwise, I'll if I can find something weird and funky that was made in France, whatever, on a shelf somewhere, I'll probably go that route.
I have a strong love and affinity for Southwest England. Like I said, my wife's family is from there. We still have family there. We go back and visit, typically every other year. And it's the heart of English cider country. And so, you know, there's just really incredible, you know, centuries old cider orchards there. Perry's, especially in the UK, are just absolutely incredible. So made from Perry pears, you know, so pears designed for cider making rather than just eating, which is what you would typically find here if you had a pear cider. So those are some of my favorites. Of the stuff we currently make, I am on an absolute kick about our Rose Meadow pomology. But otherwise, I really love our Rosé Sour from our 100% Delgo Crab apple cider, which we got more of this year and will be coming out, you know, later this year or early next. So Kelsey asks, you know, are there any weird recipes you've tried? Did they taste good? Assuming you mean on ciders, we have a really fun piece of kit called a Randall. We don't use it a whole lot at the tap room, but we used it a lot with Lionheart cider before. And it essentially allows us to infuse ciders right off the tap. And it's a great way to play around with different flavors. I've done a coffee one, a mint cider, you know, lots of really interesting things. The cool thing about cider is there's so much variety to what we can do. There's really no limit. We're only limited by our creativity. Carol and Tim, do you produce a totally dry cider? We do. We have our brut cider on tap at the tap room, which is also available in growlers. That's fermented completely bone dry. We also last year produced for New Year's our Resolution series. So our annual cider release at New Year's is called Resolution. Last year's was a sparkling dry champagne style cider. Those are really fun to make, and they do a great job of highlighting the fruit. The really important thing with all of those ciders is just making sure we have really great fruit going into them, and really great blends of bitter sharps and bittersweet cider making apples. When you're fermenting something completely bone dry and you're not adding raspberry or mangoes and habaneros to it, you know, you've got the apples and that's the base and that's what you're trying to highlight. And so those, you know, those are great ciders. And yeah, definitely look for more like that coming soon. Chris asks, does the type of yeast you use for fermentation play a big part in the outcome of the flavor of cider? Do any of your ciders use wild and spontaneous fermentation? In general, we like to avoid wild and spontaneous fermentation. There are cider makers who specialize it and love it. It creates some of the best ciders in the world and some of the nastiest ciders in the world. Going back to England, there's a cider maker there called John Oliver, not John Oliver, Oliver's cider. He's a world-renowned cider maker, but essentially what he does is he picks apples, he puts them in a barrel, and he lets them sit, at the end of fall, and they ferment about halfway, and winter comes and it slows down, and spring comes and it stops fermenting. When spring comes, and then they finish fermenting. And he's doing this in a barn with a hole in the roof. You could never make stuff and sell this like this in the U.S. But he makes absolutely incredible ciders. They don't always work, and sometimes they have a flavor, some pretty nasty off flavors that you just call barnyard. For us, we use a champagne style yeast typically, and the yeast can play a big part because different yeasts will give you different flavors that come out of it. So you might get more fruity esters from one, you might get kind of more earthy tones from another, and the yeast themselves will play kind of just a different component in the flavor from the fermentation. Jim asks, how do you describe the nose and aroma of ciders? I found it very hard to describe. Very fermentation and hint of sulfur, especially on the raspberry. Yeah, so it varies widely depending on it. So some of the nose will be, fruity and sweet. Floral is a really common expression for ciders, especially earthy tones. Raspberry's got a bit of that earthiness. Sulfur is not necessarily an uncommon nose profile in cider. Cider is a very delicate fermentation, and so sometimes sulfur can show up in it a little bit. We do try to avoid that as much as possible, but that is just a part of the natural fermentation. It's usually an indication of yeast stress during the fermentation. But yeah, I mean, so yeah, floral is very common, earthy is very common, barnyard, there's lots of different places that. You develop ciders in small batch. How do you translate into larger production to sell in cans? We typically develop ciders in small batch, or at least that's the intention. There are definitely ciders where we've made a bet on it, and we've gone for the full scale batch the first time. But even when we're doing that and we're working on projects like that, what that means is, we pull cider out of fermentation, we take the juice and we start playing with it at, 10 ounces at a time and 20 ounces at a time. And if you think you need to add, a gallon of raspberry puree to this batch, you start with half a gallon, right? So, and you always work your way up and you're tasting constantly. And that's really where Rob's expertise and experience comes to the table, where he just has a palate that has been built up over years and years and years of tasting cider every day, and has a really good understanding of where a product is in process, and knowing if I do X to it now, what my result is going to be. And it's really hard to replace just years of expertise. Sam asks, how do you decide on what flavors to make? Raspberry, habanero, etc. Yeah, that's a great question. There's not necessarily a perfect formula. We think about representing the entire breadth of ciders, at least in our tap room. We don't always have that in distribution, but at least in our tap room. And this goes back to us saying there's not really, I don't ascribe to the one single type of cider making and saying there are rules of cider making and you must follow them and this is what cider is. Instead, cider has this wide history, wide variety of flavors. And what I want to do is share our love for cider, and I want to show people the really wide varieties of cider, and so that people can find a cider that they really enjoy and they really love. And so when we think about all the different SKUs that we're going to carry, we want a dry, we want a little bit sweeter straight cider with apples, we want a couple different fruited ciders, want something spicy. We typically have a hopped cider on. We don't currently. Maybe we want to do a barrel aged, and we're trying to think about how can we have all these different areas that somebody who's new to cider may come up and say, that sounds really interesting, I want to try that. And that's our inlet, and that's how we can engage with them. And if you're sitting down and you're saying, well, raspberry cider looks good, I'm going to have a raspberry cider, it wouldn't be uncommon for you to do that at the tap room, and then one of our bartenders to give you a brut or give you a mango habanero in a tasting glass and say, why don't you try this too as well, and let us know what you think. And then Turin, do you make anything that would be good warmed? Yes, we do. So we have our hot mulled cider actually at the tap room that'll be coming out next week. We'll be launching that. And that's made from our apple seed pomology product. And so you take that and you blend that with fresh apple juice or like an orchard blend, and you can heat that up. And it creates a really incredible, delicious hot mulled cider. So definitely come to the tap room. Definitely check that out starting next week.
Oh my gosh. Rob, Jason, thank you so much for your presentation. Rob, I think we're all really jealous of your job that you get to taste all this stuff before it gets canned and bottled and put on taps at your brewery. Thanks to all of our attendees who asked such great questions. I hope you all learned a ton. I hope you guys can all get out and support Minneapolis Cider Company. You can visit their tap room, pick up some cider yourself at Surdix, Zapp's. There's all kinds of liquor stores in the Twin Cities that are carrying their products right now. So you can just learn more on their website, minneapolisciderco.com.
Minneapolis-cider.co.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right, guys. Well, I guess we will go ahead and sign off, and we'll make this recording available if you'd like to share and do a tasting with your friends and family at a later date. So Jason, Rob, thanks again. Signing off.
Thanks.
Have a great night, everyone.
If anybody ever has any questions, you can always email us at hello@minneapoliscider.co. That goes directly to me, so I'm happy to answer any of those questions as well.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Good night.